The papacy can generally be considered the winners of the investiture controversy, and they had used their increased power to push further reforms. One of these efforts was the attempt to express papal power beyond the papal states, and even beyond Europe itself in a movement known as the Crusades. The origins of the First Crusade lay in the Council of Clermont, where Pope Urban II encouraged Christian knights to end their infighting and unite to recapture Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been captured by the Turks, who had harassed Christians trying to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The Turks were a Central Asian people who had converted to Islam in the 10th century and entered the Eastern Mediterranean in the 11th century. These Turks, known as the Seljuk Turks, defeated the Byzantine armies at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus found himself in a difficult position, and he asked for military help from the Pope. This request led to Urban's speech, even though the Eastern and Western churches were still in the midst of an unresolved schism. Many soldiers responded to this call, and in 1096 a number of armies commanded by various French nobles marched on Jerusalem. After a difficult 3-year campaign, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099. They vented their frustrations by massacring the inhabitants of the city. The Crusaders established a group of states known as Outremer, beyond the sea. These 4 states were the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa. Edessa was centered on the Euphrates River, while the other 3 were all coastal. This First Crusade can be considered a success from the Christian point of view, because it achieved its goal of conquering Jerusalem. One of the significant reasons why it was successful was that the Muslims attacked by the Crusaders were divided against each other, and had only recently terminated a war between them. Over the next few decades, the Muslim states resolved some of their differences, and in 1144 launched a counterattack that captured the county of Edessa. A second crusade was announced to retake Edessa, and the major figure who preached the endeavor was Bernard of Clairvaux. Unlike the First Crusade, which was led by a collection of French nobles, this crusade gained the participation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III and the French King Louis VII. Despite these powerful men, the Second Crusade was a failure. An even larger disaster struck the Crusaders in 1187. Many Crusaders were regularly hostile to their Muslim neighbors, and this led to retaliation. In 1187, a powerful Kurdish Muslim warrior named Saladin defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin and seized Jerusalem. This time, 3 rulers signed up to retake Jerusalem: Richard I of England, Philip II Augustus of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick died on the way, and Philip and Richard couldn't cooperate. Philip left and returned to France. Richard remained in Palestine and did fight Saladin, but was only able to capture some coastal cities. The most significant of these was Acre, which would ultimately be the last crusading territory. After he feared for his army's safeties in one incident, he ordered the execution of over 2,000 Muslim prisoners of war taken at that town. In the end, Richard ended his crusade and returned to Europe, leaving Jerusalem in Muslim hands, a clear Muslim victory. In 1202, another crusade was proclaimed to retake Jerusalem, but this 4th crusade would be an absolute debacle. The Crusaders contracted with Venice to transport the soldiers overseas to the Holy Land, but they found themselves unable to pay for the service. Instead, the Venetians convinced them to pay for their passage by helping Venice in its war against the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast. While they were on this campaign, they discovered that there had been a coup in Constantinople, and the ousted emperor was willing to pay for help to reclaim the throne. The Crusaders agreed to help, and they retook Constantinople in 1204. The emperor, however, proved unable and unwilling to pay his debts, so the Crusaders overthrew him and took power themselves. The Byzantine dynasty set up a government in exile, and the Venetians set up what was known as the Latin Empire, which formed close political and economic ties with Venice in the west. Now in possession of the wealth of Constantinople, the Crusaders never bothered to advance to the Holy Land. Pope Innocent III was initially outraged by this, since Crusaders were fighting and killing Christians, but the possibility of reclaiming the East for Catholic Christianity overweighed this objection in the end. The Latin Emperor lasted for over 50 years, until the Byzantines retook their capital in 1261. After the Fourth Crusade, no crusade ever achieved anything like the undertaking of the first 3. The Fifth Crusade was led by Emperor Frederick II in 1228. The emperor negotiated with the Egyptians who controlled Palestine rather than fight them, and Christians regained access to Jerusalem's holy sites. The 6th and 7th Crusades were both led by St. Louis. The 6th was a 1249 assault on France that took Damietta in 1249 but lost the city the next year. The Crusaders were even forced to pay a ransom for themselves to escape Egypt. Louis tried again in 1270 with the 7th Crusade. This time they attacked Tunisia, but Louis fell ill and died, and the campaign was called off. The era of the Crusades is usually concluded in 1291, when the last territory of the old Crusader states, the city of Acre, was recaptured by Islamic forces. There is plenty of discussion about leading another campaign, but nothing significant was ever achieved. Instead, the crusading force shifted to the pagans in the Baltics, the Moors in Spain, and heretics in France. One of the strange secondary stories associated with the Crusades was the creation of military religious orders. The men who joined these were soldiers who also took the monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. 3 orders were particularly important: the Teutonic Knights, the Templars, and the Hospitallers. We've already discussed the Teutonic Knights. They eventually moved to the Baltic and fought against pagans there. The Templars opened chapters all throughout Europe that were devoted to raising money to back their military activities. As a result, they became wealthy and powerful, to the point that the envious King Philip IV of France misled the Pope into disbanding the order and confiscated their wealth in 1312. The Hospitallers originally served as support services to Crusaders, offering medical help and other assistance, but they also later took on military roles as escorts for pilgrims. This drive to form new religious orders wasn't limited to Crusaders. Other movements also developed, such as the Carmelites, Carthusians, and Premonstratensians. The most significant of these were the Cistercians, founded by Robert of Malesme in 1098. These men updated the Cluniacs by strictly following the strictest possible interpretation of Benedict's rule. So far, I've only mentioned religiously orthodox movements, but several other movements began that had some more radical and heretical beliefs. Sometimes these movements started off from what can be considered positive origins. The Waldensians were named after Waldo of Lyon. Waldo was a rich merchant who read the New Testament and was convinced that the church he dealt with wasn't living up to its ideals. As a result, he gave all his things away to the poor and embraced poverty. He and his followers traveled throughout Europe, denouncing the luxurious lifestyles of many Catholic bishops. This simple message, backed up by a lifestyle, won converts and led to the social interpretation of the gospel. The church responded by excommunicating the Waldensians, but their growth didn't slow at first. Another heretical group were the Cathars. Cathar means pure one. The Cathars were dualists who believed that the material world was evil and the spiritual world was the good. As a result, they rejected the God of the Old Testament who created the material world. The Cathars created a rival church organization in southern France centered around Albi. This is where they received their other name, the Albigensians. The Albigensians were a threat to their church because of their numbers and high degree of organization. They also attacked and killed the papal envoy sent to southern France. As a result, in 1208, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the Albigensians. The nobility of northern France participated, but more out of a desire to seize the lands of southern France than for any religious motives. This crusade was brutal, as entire towns were wiped out, even ones that had a majority Catholic population. In the most extreme example, the Cistercian abbot and papal envoy Arnaud d'Amaury told the Crusaders to wipe out all 20,000 residents of Béziers in order to kill the 200 heretics within. He is reported to have said, "Kill them all, God will know his own." In response to these heretical movements, in 1231 Pope Gregory IX created the Inquisition. This was a church court designed to investigate heretics, in particular any Cathars who might have escaped the crusade. The Inquisition also looked into the Waldensians and any other group that opposed the church. The Dominicans, one of the new mendicant orders we'll discuss shortly, was put in charge of the Inquisition. The Pope who had ordered the Albigensian Crusade, Innocent III, was the most forceful 13th century advocate of what became known as the papal monarchy. This shows how much secular political power the popes had acquired in the previous century. Innocent also intervened directly in the affairs of the kings of Europe. I have previously noted that it was Innocent who refused to allow Philip II Augustus to invade England. He also refused to allow him to divorce his wife. Innocent also excommunicated King John of England for the king's choice of Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope also put all of England under interdict, which meant that no sacramental church services could be conducted in the country. Ultimately, John backed down and acknowledged England as a fief from the Pope. Despite all this, Innocent's most lasting achievement was the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. It was the largest church council yet, with over 400 bishops, 800 monks, and most of the secular rulers or their representatives. The patriarchs of Constantinople and Jerusalem also attended. This council defined a number of church practices. It explained exactly what were the requirements of church membership. Specifically, it said that all adults had to confess their sins to a priest and attend communion at least once a year. Christians also needed to accept that the wine of communion transformed into the actual body and blood of Christ, a doctrine known as transubstantiation. The council lastly formally condemned the Cathars and Waldensians in order to stop to all new monastic orders. Before banning all new religious orders, Innocent made two last approvals, which he hoped to promote by denying new orders. These orders were called mendicant friars. Mendicant means beggar, and friar means brother. These friars didn't stay secluded in a monastery, but traveled the world as preachers. Their goal was to bring the gospel to people. They could not own anything, and were therefore entirely dependent on donations, hence the name beggar. These friars became successful, and huge donations rolled in, allowing them to construct churches and friaries. A friary was a dormitory to sleep in, but it did not have the other attributes of a monastery. The first of these orders were the Franciscans, named after St. Francis of Assisi. The second were the Dominicans, who had spearheaded the Inquisition, founded by St. Dominic Guzman. Pope Innocent was the high watermark of papal power, and while later popes would claim his authority, they ultimately weren't able to back it up. During the 13th century, the kings of England and France gained power, and they proved themselves more willing to challenge the Pope. Even the threat of excommunication wouldn't harm them. Boniface VIII would be the one to suffer for this power loss. He wrote the papal pronouncement Unum Sanctum, which claimed that the Pope was superior to both kings and emperors. It was not well received. As I mentioned in a previous lesson, Boniface was in the middle of a showdown with Philip IV of France over taxation. Enraged, a group of French soldiers broke into Boniface's palace and captured him. Although he escaped, he died shortly after the ordeal. After Boniface's untimely death, Clement V, a Frenchman, was elected pope. Clement was convinced by Philip IV and the French Church to move the center of church administration from Rome to Avignon. Avignon is on the Rhone River and under heavy French influence. After Clement moved the administration of the church to Avignon in 1309, it would remain there until 1377. This period has been called by its detractors the Babylonian captivity, and every pope elected during the 68 years was French. As you can imagine, many Christians were upset by this turn of events, especially if you weren't French. Many reformers demanded that the Pope return to Rome. Eventually, in 1378, the last Avignon Pope, Gregory XI, agreed to return to Rome. He arrived in Rome and promptly died, leading to another papal election. The cardinals elected an Italian, who became Pope Urban VI. Shortly after this, though, Urban refused to negotiate with the French cardinals, who announced that they had only elected Urban because they were afraid of the Roman mobs who were agitating for an Italian pope. Instead, they declared Urban illegitimate and elected another pope, who took the name Clement VII. Clement would be considered by Urban and his followers to be the anti-pope, or the wrong pope. Clement promptly returned to Avignon, but continued to claim to be the true pope, as did Urban. Both men also added cardinals, and the church became divided between allegiance to these two popes. The French, Spanish, Neapolitans, and Scots maintained that Clement was pope, but the English, Irish, Scandinavians, Hungarians, Poles, and Italians backed Urban. This break between rival popes became known as the Great or the Western Schism, and continued into the next generation, when the cardinals associated with each pope elected a successor without taking the other pope into consideration. As if this were not bad enough, the two groups of cardinals met together as one body in 1409 to elect a compromise candidate, John the 23rd. Neither the Pope in Rome nor the Pope in Avignon recognized John, and there were now 3 popes simultaneously. Things were completely out of hand, and to try to end these destabilizing circumstances, John called a general council to solve the crisis. This did set a potentially bad example, because it seemed to say that the Pope didn't have supreme authority, but that a church council could make decisions above those of the Pope. The council, known as the Council of Constance, met and officially deposed all 3 popes. They selected as their replacement Martin V. The emperor backed this decision, and the other popes were forced to back down, ending the Great Schism in 1417. The schism greatly reduced the power of the Pope, and few popes in the future had any power beyond Italy. During the schism, the Church was absorbed in this power struggle and unable to curb heresy. Once the schism was reconciled, then, one of the first issues to deal with was heresy. The most significant of these movements was led by the Englishman John Wycliffe and his followers, known as Lollards. Wycliffe criticized the Church for its hierarchy and emphasis on wealth. He also believed that the Bible should be the primary source of Christian theology, not the words of popes or church councils. To this end, he translated the Bible into English, which could then be read and interpreted by common people. Wycliffe died in 1384, but he influenced the Czech church reformer Jan Hus, who was invited to the Council of Constance. Hus thought he'd be able to defend his beliefs, but instead he was condemned and burned to death. Hus's death outraged the Czech people, who rebelled against their feudal lord the emperor. These patriotic wars were known as the Hussite Wars, and they ended with a compromise with the Church. One of the final decisions of the Council of Constance determined that church councils would meet at regular intervals to rule in cooperation with the Pope. Martin V dutifully called the Council of Basel in 1431 to propose further church reform, but Martin's successor turned against Basel. This successor was Eugene IV, and the Council of Basel tried to depose him in 1437. Eugene responded by calling a second church council, the Council of Ferrara-Florence. Ferrara-Florence worked to end the division between the Eastern and Western churches, and even came up with a draft proposal in tandem with the Byzantines. Unfortunately, it was never implemented, for the Byzantine state was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. When the Ottomans forbade the Eastern Church from forming relations with the Western Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church rejected the decisions of Ferrara-Florence in 1472.